Alright, yeah, and welcome back to some more Magic Duels. This week we're taking a look at a Golgari Sacrifice deck. This was a deck submitted by My Hair is Made of Cats. Your argument is invalid. Yes, so it essentially is a sacrifice deck that revolves around getting creatures in and out of your graveyard and getting a lot of card advantage and stuff like that. And a lot of your removals based around killing your own creatures as well. So, yeah, essentially there isn't a standout card in this deck. It all sort of works in its own little way. It all helps. It's a communist deck. There you go. Every little bit helps to make it super amazing. So let's start at the beginning anyway. We've got a 1-mana Sanitarium Skeleton. So 1/2, nothing too special except for you can pay 3 and you can return it from your graveyard to your hand. So this is a recurring creature. So you can use it as a chump blocker or something like that. It does, it is a bit of a mana sink if you're going to use it in that sort of fashion. But if you were to use it as sacrifice fodder or something like that, getting it back and forth from your graveyard to always have something in your hand or on the battlefield to get rid of is really good. So that's why it's a 2 of. And mostly a 2 of as well, because once you've got one, you don't really need more than that. So you don't want to see 4 of them really. Next we've got Blister Pod, another 1-mana 1/1 creature, but when this one dies you get a colourless Eldrazi Sound creature with the mana ability. So this one is great because it is sort of a 2 sacrifice for 1 creature, 2 for 1 in creature standards anyway. It can be used to block and can be used to sack twice over for a lot of card advantage. So maybe Bone Splinters, the Blister Pod, you still get a sound to block the next turn and you've just destroyed one of their big creatures. That's mostly what it's there for. Next we've got Vampiric Rites. This is a permanent way of sacrificing creatures. So you pay 2, you sacrifice a creature, you gain 1 life and you draw a card. So one thing this deck does really well is keep card advantage going quite well. So in this case you can pay 2 to sacrifice a creature and you get to draw cards. There's also ways further down where you sacrifice to draw 2 cards, you can get creatures back, you know, that kind of thing. Sacrifice to draw cards. A lot of sacrifice to refill your hand and keep that tempo going. So once you've got to that sort of level where you can start reanimating spells for like 3 mana at a time, then you essentially just enter this loop of sack and reanimate, and it's really hard for your opponents to deal with. Bone Splinters, as we mentioned, as an additional cost to cast it, you have to sacrifice a creature. Normally a problem in our deck, it is actually a benefit in some cases, and we get to destroy target creature. So we get to take down their biggest creatures as long as they're not indestructible, like Ulamog or something like that. You can take down any creature you want. Really good to stop their big creatures, because if you've been chumping with a Sanitarium Skeleton for so long, you could Bone Splinters it away, and then you've dealt with it essentially. And then we've got, for 2 mana, a Rot Shambler. This is one of the ways that we benefit from sacrificing creatures. So when another creature you control dies, you get to put a 1/1 counter on Rot Shambler. This creature can get really big really fast. And just remember that to your Scions that you get from Blister Pod and from Beyond, to make the mana from them, that's actually a sacrifice trigger. So you can get yourself some mana and still get a sacrifice on that. So yeah, it's really good synergy with the deck. That's why it's a 3 of. It's perfect. You can get really big as well and swing in for quite a hefty amount of damage. Unfortunately, none of the cards in this have trample, but we tend to tempo our opponent out, so eventually we will force them to block with all the creatures, and they'll have their hand empty hopefully at that point. Altar's Reap, this is our way of getting card advantage. As an additional cost to cast it, you have to sacrifice a creature, so that could be a Blister Pod for no downside whatsoever. It could be a Sanitarium Skeleton and you just get it back later. And if you do that, then you get to draw 2 cards, so it refills our hand up, and the creature we lose, we likely get back later on. We've got plenty of ways of doing that. And speaking of, we've got Mccobb Waltz. So for 2 mana, return 2 target creature cards from your graveyard to your hand, then discard a card. The discard is a little bit of a disadvantage here, unless you've got something like a Sanitarium Skeleton, which can get itself back. So this will be the creature that you would discard if you really need to discard something at all. But to get 2 creature cards back as 2 little blockers, 2 extra sacks is really good. We've got Rabid Bite. So for 2 mana, it's a fight card. Target creature you control deals damage equal to its power to target creature you don't control. Fortunately, this doesn't have the opponent's creature deal damage back to ours, so it's half a fight card in that sense. So we're only dealing damage to them. If we've got a big Rot Shambler, it's just straight up removal. We can also use it to kill our own creatures intentionally, maybe, if we wanted to do that. We can also Nantu CoHost, get Nantu CoHost real big, and then Rabid Bite to take something out if we wanted to do it that way. Speaking of Nantu CoHost, this is probably the one card that keeps the engine going most of all. So for 3 mana, you can sacrifice a creature, doesn't cost you to do it, and Nantu CoHost gets +2/+2 until the end of the turn. This could either be your end game. If they don't block it, then you can sacrifice your entire board, and you can come in for like 15 or something like that. In playtesting, that's one way that I've actually won. They forgot that I could make this creature really big. But it's also a good way to get Sanitarium Skeletons in and out of your graveyard to get Rot Shambler triggers and stuff like that. And Vampiric Rites, plenty of targets if you can keep reanimating stuff. Pulsa Murasa. This card came in very handy against aggressive decks. So for 3 mana, you can return target creature or land from a graveyard, to its owner's hand, and you gain 6 life. The 6 life's where it comes in handy most of all, but it's also a 3 mana, not so much reanimate, but to pull a creature from your graveyard back to your hand is really good that way. I went against a white weenie deck that nearly beat me, but I ended up getting 2 pulses in a row. Ended up getting 12 life and pulling back chump blockers long enough for me to get Rot Shamblers down to start getting card advantage and bigger creatures to start blocking his, which was really good. Stuff like this is really good against aggro and that kind of thing. Nyssa, Voice of Zendikar. For 3 mana, she's got a +1 ability to put a 0/1 plant creature token. Great sacrifice fodder, that's mostly what it's there for. She can also -2, and she can put a 1/1 counter on each creature you control. So one thing this deck does really well is keep creatures around. So every creature has a way of coming back at some point. So with that in mind, your board ends up getting quite clogged after a while. And if you can -2 Nyssa, then you can get a lot of advantage out of that. -7, you gain X life and draw X cards, where X is the number of lands you control. Speaks for itself most of all. If you get it on curve and you're plussing the entire time, by the time she ultimates, it's gain 7 life, draw 7 cards, where X is the number of lands. So you can refill your hand with this ultimate, which is really good. That's probably a game ender in itself, because the sheer amount of card advantage isn't something most decks can deal with. We've got Smothering Abomination for 4 mana. A flying 4/3. At the beginning of your upkeep, sacrifice a creature. We can include the Smothering Abomination in that sacrifice, so bear that in mind. And when you sacrifice a creature, you can get to draw a card. So at the beginning of every turn, we're going to sacrifice a Scion token or a Blister Pod or a Sanitarium Skeleton, and we're going to get to draw 2 cards per turn based off of that. Normally, there may be a downside where it ends up destroying your board very slowly, but we can just sacrifice the Abomination at any point, and we've got plenty of ways to get it back. So it's just sheer card advantage, and it's a flying 4/3, which quite a fair few decks can't deal with flyers that big, so it's really good in that sense. And we can also sacrifice the 0/1 plant tokens as we're plussing up, so we'll have a full hand with a Smothering Abomination in play, just as long as we have the creatures required to sack it. Eyeless Watcher. For 4 mana, it's a 1/1. Pretty crappy by itself, but you do get 2 1/1 colourless Eldrazi's that are capable of sacrificing themselves and pumping your creatures up. So you can ramp yourself into a Baloth, for example, in the next turn, or just generally have lots of sacrifice fodder, lots of blockers. This is 3 blockers for 1 card, so it's really good in that sense. Then we've got From Beyond, a 4 mana enchantment. At the beginning of your upkeep, put a 1/1 colourless Eldrazi Scion onto the battlefield with the sacrifice ability. We can also pay 2 and sacrifice it to search our library for an Eldrazi card, reveal it, and put it into our hand. I'm not sure about the secondary ability, how useful it is in this deck. Because I think most of all, as long as you've got some sort of way of getting sacrifice advantage, you probably really want the upkeep stuff. And we have no way of getting the From Beyond from our graveyard back onto the battlefield. So I would say I've not come across a reason why you would want to sacrifice this over just getting the Eldrazi Scions from it. But, you know, maybe in a winning situation you might want to grab something like a Smothering Abomination or something like that so that you can swing over the top if you're confident they can't remove it and they don't have flyers, you know. Finally, we've got a 6-mana Baloth Null. When it enters the battlefield, return up to 2 target creatures from your graveyard to your hand. So yet again, a lot of recursion for our creatures. 2 cards of any kind. It could be a Smothering Abomination and an Eyeless Watcher. It could be 2 of our Sanitarium Skeletons. It could be Blister Pods, you know. Plenty of card advantage at that point, and you can just end up clogging up the board with it, and it's really good. And it's a 4/5, so it's a decent blocker, and it survives most removal that isn't just hard-casted removal. So, without further ado, let's go to the land base. The land base is fairly simple. So we've got 10 swamps and 7 forests, because we have a lot of black mana, especially in the early game with 1-drops, which is why the skew is in one direction. I haven't had many mana screws at all. You maybe want to skew it in another way if you really want Nyssa down on time every time. But for the most part, I think this is fairly standard. I might try 9/8 at some point. But for now, it's doing just fine. And we've got 2 Westvale Abbeys. As I mentioned before, we have plenty of ways of recurring creatures. So we can start clogging up the board, and it's not too difficult with a From Beyond on the battlefield for us to get up to that 5 limit to be able to sacrifice it and transform it into Ormondal, the Profane Prince. So that's a 9/7 flying lifelink, indestructible haste. This creature comes down. As long as you're not losing badly, it's game over for your opponent. It's just sheer advantage that you just can't get rid of. It's 18-point life swing if there's no blockers. So yeah, there's not much recovering from a straight up swing like that. We haven't got much use for the colourless mana, unfortunately, though. So maybe there might be a creature. I haven't really had much time to look into editing this deck, if I'm honest. So if you guys have any improvements for the deck, though, be sure to leave them in the comments section, and I'll be sure to look at them and see if they work. So we've got a 2 Woodland Cemetery, so it comes in tapped unless you control a swamp or a forest. So this is an early game untapped dual land. Really good. There are the green-black lands that I didn't actually look into. So Hissing Quagmire might be kind of good. You can actually get that back with the Pulsa Murasa, so maybe that's an inclusion. The downside is it is a tapped land, so we're maybe not too concerned with using it. I don't think there's any other Golgari lands. We could use the Mortuary Mires perhaps, but yet again it is a tapped land, and this one in particular is just a tapped swamp. And the Fertile Thicket is just to put lands on top of your library, which isn't too great. But yeah, so I think the land base is fairly good. It's likely to never come in tapped for anything. The Woodland Cemeteries are the only exception to that, and it's highly unlikely we haven't put a basic in before them. So then we have 2 Rogue's Passage, so it creates colourless mana, so you're not setting yourself back by playing it. And for 4 mana, you get to make one of your creatures unblockable. This is in here for the Nantuko Husk, which is right here. So if you make this unblockable and your opponent's tapped down, and you have quite the board but you just can't get through, make this one unblockable, sack your entire board. You can potentially attack in for 16, you know, that size. It's a game ender as long as you've got a decent enough board. So if you're in a stalemate situation, you've got yourself an Nantuko Husk, you're not in a stalemate anymore as long as you've got the Rogue's Passage. So that's going to do it for the deck. So if you want to see the matches, it should be following shortly after this one, if not already. If you have any improvements, then be sure to leave them down in the comments section below. And also, if you want your deck to be shown the week after then be sure to send me a deck either by email in the comments section below or on Twitter. It's up to you. It's fine by me. Right, guys, I'll see you in the matches. See you in a bit.